Picture a perfect coronation day. The sun glitters off golden carriages. The streets are lined with cheering crowds. And at the center of it all, a monarch, serene and majestic, ready to be crowned in a flawless ceremony of ancient tradition and absolute power. It's the image we all have in our minds, the storybook ending to a journey towards the throne. But what if I told you that for centuries, behind that glittering facade, coronation days have been some of the most spectacularly chaotic, hilariously awkward, and sometimes genuinely tragic disasters in royal history? This is the human drama that official portraits and state films never show you, the moments when centuries of meticulous planning collide with sheer, unadulterated chaos. We are about to pull back the velvet curtain on the monarchy's most important day to reveal the truth that for every moment of sublime pageantry, there's a corresponding moment of pure, pants-dropping pandemonium. Think about the immense pressure. An entire nation, often the entire world, is watching. Every movement, every word, every symbolic gesture is choreographed down to the second, meant to project an image of divine right and unshakable order. But then a nervous bishop fumbles the crown. A horse chosen for its impeccable temperament decides the Archbishop of Canterbury looks like a tasty snack. A queen's heavy robes are secretly pinned to the carpet so she doesn't trip, turning a sacred procession into a delicate dance with disaster. These aren't just minor slip-ups. They are breathtaking cracks in the perfect royal veneer, moments when fallible human beings are revealed underneath the weight of imperial expectations. It's in these blunders that we see the true, fascinating, and often deeply relatable story. The story of people trying desperately to hold it together while everything that can go wrong spectacularly does. So if you've ever suspected that history's most solemn occasions were far more interesting than the textbooks let on, you are in the right place. We're going on a journey through the annals of royal misadventure, exploring the coronation day disasters that ranged from the absurdly funny to the genuinely heartbreaking. We'll meet kings who were nearly late to their own coronations, precious jewels that went mysteriously missing at the worst possible moment, and ceremonies so plagued by misfortune they seemed almost cursed. This is the side of royalty you won't find in dry historical accounts. It's a story of ambition, vanity, and the glorious, unpredictable mess of being human, even when you're wearing a crown. So settle in, because we are about to dive head first into the chaos, the comedy, and the captivating truth behind the throne. To understand just how deep this tradition of coronation chaos runs, we need to travel all the way back to the very foundation of modern English monarchy, to a day that was supposed to solidify a brutal conquest, but instead nearly went up in literal smoke. The year was 1066, on Christmas Day no less, and William the Conqueror was about to be crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. He had fought his way to the throne, defeating Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, and this coronation was the final sacred step in legitimizing his rule. The atmosphere, however, was far from celebratory. London was an occupied city, simmering with resentment against the new Norman regime. Inside the abbey, the air was thick with tension as English nobles mingled uneasily with William's Norman retainers, all under the watchful eyes of his elite private guards stationed outside. The ceremony began, and the Archbishop posed the traditional question to the assembled crowd: asking if they would accept William as their king. The English congregation, following custom, shouted their assent in unison. But to the Norman guards posted at the doors, who understood not a word of Old English, this sudden, loud eruption of noise from inside the holy building sounded like anything but acclamation. In their minds, it could only mean one thing: a trap had been sprung. The treacherous Saxons were rising up and attacking their duke inside the abbey. With a fierce loyalty that quickly turned to catastrophic panic, the guards decided on a brutally simple diversionary tactic. They began setting fire to the surrounding buildings. Imagine the scene inside for a moment. William is at the most solemn point of his life, kneeling in prayer when the scent of smoke begins to curl into the abbey. Then comes the sound of crackling flames and distant screams from outside. Suddenly, the great doors burst open as terrified nobles, both Norman and English, flooded back into the church, shouting about a fire and an uprising. Thick black smoke poured in, obscuring the altar. In an instant, sacred dignity evaporated into sheer, unadulterated terror. Believing they were under attack, the entire congregation, save for a handful of trembling clergy and William's own closest advisors, turned and fled the abbey, scrambling over one another to escape the perceived danger. William himself, as chroniclers of the time recorded, was left shaking violently, terrified and alone before the altar. The ceremony was rushed to its conclusion, with a bishop hastily placing the crown on his head while the new king trembled, not with piety, but with raw fear. His guards, in their misguided attempt to protect him, had created the very chaos they feared, reducing the foundational coronation of a dynasty to a smoky, chaotic, and almost solitary affair. It was a spectacularly unlucky omen, proving that from the very beginning, no amount of military might could armor a monarch against the fumbles and fears of their own coronation day. Moving forward several centuries, we encounter a coronation that was not about ancient lineage, but about forging an empire from pure ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte's self-coronation in 1804 was a spectacle designed from the ground up to project absolute power. Having risen from a military commander to the ruler of France, Napoleon understood that symbols were just as potent as armies. He orchestrated his coronation as a piece of political theater, inviting Pope Pius VII from Rome to lend an air of divine sanction to the proceedings. The stage was set in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, transformed for the event into a lavish display of imperial might. Everyone in attendance, and indeed all of Europe watching from afar, expected the Pope to perform the sacred act of placing the crown on the new emperor's head, as had been tradition for 1,000 years. But Napoleon had a different, breathtakingly audacious script in mind. At the pivotal moment, as the Pope reached for the golden laurel wreath, Napoleon stopped him. In a gesture that echoed through the halls of history, he reached out, took the crown from the pontiff's hands, and placed it upon his own head. It was a calculated, stunning power move, a declaration to the world that his authority came not from God or the church, but from his own will and military genius. He was in effect telling the assembled nobles and the watching world that he was the sole architect of his destiny. Yet, while Napoleon successfully controlled that central, defining moment of self-coronation, he could not control every variable in his meticulously planned pageant. The drama was far from over, and it would next unfold at the feet of his wife, the Empress Josephine. Following the coronation ceremony, the newly crowned imperial couple had to ascend a specially constructed, incredibly steep dais to reach their throne. Josephine, resplendent in a heavy, jewel-encrusted gown and weighed down by an enormous velvet mantle lined with ermine, began her climb. The immense physical burden of her regalia, combined with the precarious incline of the steps, proved too much. As she climbed, she faltered, her balance compromised by the sheer weight and bulk of her imperial costume. For a heart-stopping moment, she began to stumble backward, threatening to tumble down the stairs in front of the entire court and diplomatic corps. It was only the quick intervention of one of Napoleon's aides, who physically supported her from behind, that prevented a complete and very public fall. In the superstitious atmosphere of the early 19th century, such an event was not seen as a simple mishap. It was interpreted as a powerful and deeply troubling omen. While Napoleon had just proclaimed his self-made power, his empress, the very symbol of the dynasty he was trying to found, nearly fell on her way to the throne. The physical stumble was instantly read as a metaphor for the instability of his new empire. Gossip and anxious whispers spread through the ballrooms and salons of Europe. If the foundation was this unsteady, how long could the structure possibly last? The moment perfectly captured the fragile nature of Napoleon's grand project. He could seize a crown with his own hands, but he could not command fortune itself. This single, awkward incident, overshadowed by the drama of the self-crowning, but deeply symbolic in its own right, hinted at the eventual unraveling of his ambitions, a prophecy of a downfall as steep and sudden as the steps Josephine struggled to climb. If the chaos of Napoleon's coronation was a whisper of future downfall, the coronation of King George IV of England in 1821 was a full-throated roar of public contempt. This was not a ceremony plagued by accidental fires or simple stumbles. This was a carefully calculated, publicly funded spectacle that backfired spectacularly, revealing a monarchy completely divorced from the people it was meant to rule. George, who had waited decades as Prince Regent for the throne, was determined to have a coronation that outshone all others, a breathtaking display of his taste and power. Yet his grand vision was entirely overshadowed by two colossal problems: his publicly detested wife and a nation pushed to the brink of starvation. At the heart of the scandal was Caroline of Brunswick, the woman George had been forced to marry and whom he loathed with a passion that was both personal and political. They had been separated for years, and while George lived in lavish decadence, Caroline had traveled across Europe, her behavior fueling salacious gossip that George eagerly used against her. He had even instigated a parliamentary trial in an attempt to divorce her for adultery, a spectacle that had turned the entire country against him and made Caroline an unlikely populist heroine. By the time of his coronation, George had explicitly barred Caroline from the ceremony, refusing to have her recognized as his queen. But Caroline was not one to go quietly. On the morning of the coronation, she arrived at the doors of Westminster Abbey in a carriage, determined to claim her right to be crowned alongside her husband. What unfolded was a scene of pure theatrical pandemonium. George, paranoid about her attempting exactly this, had transformed the approaches to the abbey into a fortified encampment. Soldiers lined the streets, and temporary wooden barricades were erected to control the massive, volatile crowds. When Caroline's carriage pulled up, she was met not by respectful heralds, but by locked gates and armed guards. The scene quickly devolved into a shouting match that echoed the divisions of the entire nation. As Caroline demanded entry, her supporters in the crowd roared their approval, while the king's loyalists jeered and booed. For nearly an hour, she was shuttled from one entrance to another, each time being met with a firm, humiliating refusal from officials acting on the king's direct orders. The noise from the mobs outside was so deafening it reportedly drowned out the choirs singing inside the abbey. This was not a dignified state occasion. It was a public brawl, with the Queen of England herself as the central figure in a desperate and futile struggle for recognition. Inside, oblivious to none of this, sat the fuming king. Dressed in an absurdly extravagant costume of velvet and ermine, with a wig of elaborate curls, he was reportedly apoplectic with rage, his face a thunderous mask of fury every time a messenger brought him updates on the commotion at the doors. His much-anticipated moment of glory was being utterly hijacked by the woman he despised most in the world. The contrast between the two realities was almost unbelievable. Within the abbey, the air was thick with the scent of perfume and the glitter of thousands of candles reflecting off priceless jewels. The ceremony was a marathon of excess, choreographed to project an image of unchallengeable, divine right monarchy. But just outside those hallowed walls, the air was thick with the anger of the people and the cries of a rejected queen, a stark reminder of the profound disconnect between the monarch and his subjects. This disconnect was made all the more grotesque by the sheer, staggering cost of the event. While the country was suffering a deep economic depression, with widespread unemployment and hunger following the Napoleonic Wars, George IV spent the modern equivalent of tens of millions of pounds on his coronation. He commissioned lavish new banquets, extravagant costumes, and a new, gaudy royal carriage that was so heavy it damaged the streets. He gorged himself on a feast while his people starved. The public relations disaster was total. The image of a self-indulgent, petty king, barricaded inside his palace of pageantry against the rightful claims of his wife and the justified anger of his citizens, was seared into the national consciousness. The coronation of George IV was not a celebration of a new reign. It was a lavish funeral for the monarchy's reputation, a day when the rough music of public scorn proved far more powerful than any anthem sung in the abbey. If the coronation of George IV was a lesson in the dangers of decadence, the ascension of his brother, William IV, just 9 years later, presented a case study in the opposite extreme. After the outrageous extravagance of his predecessor, the new king was determined to be the complete antithesis. William was a simple, unpretentious man, a former naval officer who was far more comfortable on the deck of a ship than on a gilded throne. He saw the monarchy not as a vehicle for personal glory, but as a public institution that should reflect the sober, responsible mood of a nation still recovering from economic hardship. And so, when the time came to plan his coronation in 1831, he made a decision that sent shockwaves through the aristocratic establishment. He decided to slash the budget to the bone. The result was a ceremony so stripped down, so devoid of its traditional splendor, that it was instantly and mockingly nicknamed the Half-Crown-ation. William's frugality wasn't just a minor adjustment. It was a wholesale dismantling of centuries of tradition. The most stunning casualty was the coronation banquet, a lavish feast in Westminster Hall that had been a centerpiece of the ceremony since the time of Richard the Lionheart. This was the event where the king's champion, in full armor, would ride into the hall and theatrically challenge anyone who disputed the monarch's right to the throne. It was a spectacle of chivalric pomp and gluttonous excess, and King William simply canceled it. He saw it as an archaic, wasteful anachronism, but in doing so, he didn't just eliminate a party. He erased a powerful symbol of royal power and hospitality, a ritual that connected the new monarchy to its medieval past. The cuts didn't stop there. The usual elaborate procession through the streets of London was drastically scaled back. The guest list was trimmed, leaving many expectant nobles without an invitation. The traditional distribution of coronation medals to the public was limited to save money. Even the very attire of the participants was affected, with reports suggesting that the king himself wanted to wear a simple admiral's uniform instead of the full, regal robes of state. Everywhere one looked, the grandeur was dialed down. What was left was a functional, bare-bones ceremony inside Westminster Abbey that lasted a mere fraction of the time his brother's marathon had. To William, this was common sense. To the assembled peers of the realm and the ambassadors from every major European court, it was nothing short of a profound insult. The atmosphere in the Abbey was one of bewilderment and deep disappointment. Foreign dignitaries, who had traveled great distances expecting a breathtaking display of British power and wealth, were left confused by the lackluster affair. They had come to witness a magnificent affirmation of the world's most powerful monarchy, and instead found what looked like a rushed committee meeting with some added choir music. The British aristocracy was even more affronted. For them, the coronation was not just a ceremony. It was their moment in the spotlight, a vital reaffirmation of their own status and their place in the great hierarchy of the nation. By stripping away the pageantry, William was inadvertently signaling that their roles, their ancient traditions, and their very importance were also being diminished. The event felt less like a celebration and more like an administrative chore that the king was eager to be done with. This austerity-driven disaster proved a crucial point. A coronation could be ruined just as effectively by spending too little as by spending too much. George IV's success had created a chasm between the monarchy and the people, but William IV's parsimony created a chasm between the monarchy and the very classes that propped it up. He failed to understand that in the theater of state, symbolism is substance. The glitter, the gold, the processions, and the banquets were not mere frivolities. They were the visible, tangible expression of the crown's power, stability, and continuity. By presenting a budget version of a coronation, he made the crown itself look cheap, as if the institution he was leading wasn't worth the expense of a proper celebration. It was a well-intentioned but catastrophic misreading of the political moment, demonstrating that even with the best of intentions, a king could fumble his most important day by forgetting that he was, first and foremost, playing a part on the world stage. After the stark parsimony of the Half-Crown-ation, The British public and establishment were desperate for a coronation that felt like a proper celebration, a return to glory and national pride. The ascension of the 18-year-old Queen Victoria in 1838 provided that perfect opportunity. Here was a young, vibrant monarch, a symbol of a new era dawning after the dissolute reigns of her uncles. The nation was captivated, and expectations for a magnificent ceremony were sky high. Yet, what should have been a flawless display of renewed pomp and precision descended into one of the most chaotically endearing farces in Westminster Abbey's long history, all because of one critical, almost unbelievable oversight. Nobody had thought to hold a proper rehearsal. The result was a ceremony where virtually no one, from the highest-ranking bishop to the most elderly peer, seemed to know what they were supposed to do or when they were supposed to do it. The sacred, timeless ritual quickly unraveled into a series of comic blunders, with the young queen at the center, trying desperately to maintain her composure. The first major stumble came during the act of homage, when the elderly and infirm Lord Roll, a peer in his 80s, approached the steps to the throne to pledge his allegiance. The steps were steep, his legs were weak, and in his effort to ascend, he lost his footing completely. To the horror of the assembled congregation, Lord Roll quite literally lived up to his name, tumbling and rolling down the carpeted steps. Gasps echoed through the abbey. The young queen, showing a remarkable presence of mind that would become her trademark, immediately rose from the throne and stepped forward, her hand outstretched in a gesture of concern to help the poor, prostrate lord. This spontaneous act of kindness endeared her to the crowd instantly, transforming a moment of physical calamity into one of human compassion. But it also set the tone for a ceremony where the script was being rewritten by sheer accident. No sooner had order been somewhat restored than the clerical errors began. The Bishop of Durham, a key figure in the ceremony, was tasked with placing the coronation ring, a symbol of the Queen's marriage to the nation, onto her finger. The ring had been specially resized for her small hand, but in the flustered atmosphere, the bishop forced it onto the wrong finger, jamming it painfully onto her fourth finger instead of the third. Victoria, in her own later writings, described the agony of the moment, noting how she had to later soak her swollen finger in ice water to remove the tightly wedged ring. The bishop, seemingly oblivious, then proceeded to give her the scepter at the wrong moment in the proceedings, leaving her clutching an array of heavy, symbolic objects like a confused concert-goer holding too many programs. The clergy, it appeared, were as unprepared as the nobility, fumbling their way through a service they were supposed to command. The confusion reached its peak with the presentation of the orb, a golden sphere representing Christ's dominion over the world. A bewildered peer, perhaps caught up in the general disarray or simply misreading his cues, marched up to the throne and presented the orb to her far too early in the service. There was simply no provision in the ancient liturgy for the monarch to hold it at that point. Victoria, unsure of what to do with this premature symbol of global authority, was later advised by the quick-thinking Lord John Thynne to simply hand it back. The sight of the Queen of England passing a priceless golden orb back to appear like a misplaced parcel was both absurd and strangely humanizing. Throughout it all, her youth, which many had feared would be a liability, became her greatest asset. Her diary entries reveal not anger, but a kind of bewildered amusement at the sheer incompetence unfolding around her. She was the one calm, constant figure in a sea of flustered dignitaries, a young woman patiently enduring a ceremony that everyone else seemed to be performing for the very first time. This coronation, intended to project an image of unchallengeable divine right and timeless tradition, instead became a powerful testament to the fact that beneath the crowns and the robes, the entire apparatus of the state was ultimately run by fallible human beings, capable of turning sublime solemnity into glorious, unforgettable farce. If Victoria's coronation was a farce born from simple disorganization, the coronation of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia in 1896 was a tragedy of almost unimaginable scale, a catastrophe that seemed to foreshadow the bloody end of his entire dynasty. The event was intended to be a magnificent spectacle of imperial power, a display meant to awe his own people and the watching world. After the solemn ceremony in the Ouspensky Cathedral, where Nicholas and his wife Alexandra were crowned with the ancient, jewel-encrusted regalia of the Romanovs, the celebrations were to move to Kadinka Field, a vast military training ground on the outskirts of Moscow. The government had planned a grand public festival, complete with food, drink, and entertainment for hundreds of thousands of the Tsar's subjects. The centerpiece was the distribution of special coronation gifts, a commemorative enameled cup filled with a portion of sausage, gingerbread, and a small bag of pretzels and sweets, all wrapped in a brightly decorated kerchief. For the impoverished peasants and workers who flocked to the field, this simple parcel was a precious token, a tangible piece of a historic day they could take home to their families. But the authorities, in their arrogant planning, had created a perfect storm of conditions for disaster. The problem lay in the field itself and the sheer, unmanaged scale of the crowd. Kadinka Field was riddled with deep, hidden trenches and gullies, remnants of its military use, and the organizers had made no effort to fill them in or properly mark them as hazards. They had also erected a series of flimsy wooden stalls and barricades to control the gift distribution, creating a series of deadly bottlenecks. On the night before the event, a crowd of over 500,000 people gathered, pressed together in the darkness, waiting for the festivities to begin at dawn. As the sun rose and the time for the gift distribution neared, a wild, destabilizing rumor began to sweep through the immense throng. There weren't enough gifts to go around. The rumor was likely true, given the unexpected size of the crowd, but it was the spark that ignited the tinderbox. A wave of panic surged through the people at the front. They surged forward, desperate not to be left empty-handed, while those at the back, unaware of the danger, pressed in to get a better view. What happened next was a scene from a nightmare. The crowd became a human avalanche. People at the front were pushed, stumbling, into the unseen trenches and pits, where they were immediately trampled by the thousands of people surging uncontrollably from behind. There was no way to stop, no way to turn back. Witnesses described the sound as a low, terrible moan that rose into screams of pure terror, soon drowned out by the sheer force of the crushing bodies. Those who fell were suffocated or had their bones broken underfoot. When the stampede finally subsided, the field was a horrifying tableau of destruction. The official death toll was listed at 1,389, with another 1,000 plus seriously injured, though many historians believe the true number was far higher. Piles of bodies were laid out in rows, and the coveted coronation gifts lay scattered amidst the mud and the dead. Their bright kerchiefs, a grotesquely cheerful contrast to the carnage. And this is where Nicholas II, a man history would judge as tragically weak and indecisive, made the decision that would haunt his reign forever. His advisors, principally his uncles who were in charge of the event, urged him to project an image of strength and normality. They argued that canceling the rest of the coronation schedule, particularly a glittering ball hosted by the French ambassador that evening, would be seen as a sign of weakness, an admission of guilt that could destabilize the monarchy. Against the advice of his more compassionate ministers, Nicholas acquiesced. He and Alexandra made a brief summer visit to a hospital to see the wounded, a gesture that felt hollow and obligatory. Then, that very night, while the city was still in a state of shock and mourning, the Tsar and Tsarina attended the magnificent ball at the French embassy. They were seen smiling and dancing the night away, seemingly indifferent to the mountain of corpses that had been piled up just hours earlier in his name. The public outrage was immediate and ferocious. The nickname Nicholas the Bloody was coined overnight, a label of profound contempt that would stick to him for the rest of his life. The decision to go to the ball was not just a public relations catastrophe. It was a profound moral failure. It revealed a court and a monarch completely insulated from the suffering of their people, more concerned with diplomatic appearances and aristocratic ritual than with the lives of the common men and women they were sworn to protect. The Conqueror tragedy was no longer just a terrible accident of poor planning. It was now a powerful political symbol. For revolutionaries like a young Vladimir Lenin, it became a perfect illustration of the Tsarist regime's brutal disregard for human life. For the average Russian, it shattered the myth of the Tsar as the benevolent little father, a protector who cared for his people. The coronation, intended to solidify Nicholas's power, instead planted the seeds of the revolution that would ultimately consume him, his family, and the entire Russian Empire. It stands as a stark, sobering reminder that the most disastrous coronations are not those with fumbled rings or stumbling lords, but those where the crown becomes permanently stained with the blood of its subjects. Just when the British monarchy thought it had endured every possible variety of coronation chaos, from fiery riots to budget cuts and fatal stampedes, a new and uniquely modern crisis emerged at the dawn of the 20th century, one that pitted ancient tradition against the startling advances of modern medicine. The stage was set for the coronation of Edward VII in the summer of 1902. After 64 years spent as the Prince of Wales, a period he had famously filled with a life of pleasure, diplomatic travel, and a series of scandals, the portly and popular Bertie was finally about to have his own day in the sun. The plans were the most elaborate and globally coordinated in history, a spectacle designed to showcase the power and unity of the vast British Empire. Dignitaries and royalty from across Europe and the world had already begun arriving in London, their uniforms and jewels unpacked. The streets were draped in bunting, grandstands were erected along the procession route, and millions of commemorative mugs and medals were ready for distribution. Everything was in place for a flawless display of imperial might until the king himself, the central figure in this global pageant, suddenly and dramatically began to fall apart. It started with persistent, debilitating abdominal pain. At first, the king's physicians dismissed it as a simple case of overtaxed nerves or perhaps a bout of gastritis, a consequence of the rich food and immense stress leading up to the ceremony. They prescribed rest and mild remedies, hoping the discomfort would pass, but the pain only intensified, becoming so severe that Edward was forced to take to his bed, feverish and unable to carry out his duties. With the coronation just 10 days away, the truth could no longer be ignored. A specialist, Sir Frederick Treves, was summoned. After a careful examination, he delivered a diagnosis that sent a wave of pure terror through the corridors of Buckingham Palace. Appendicitis, a condition that was, at the time, often fatal if left untreated. Treves, however, was a pioneering surgeon, and he had a radical, life-saving proposal. He insisted on performing an emergency operation, a procedure to drain the infected abscess, right there in a hastily prepared room in the palace. This was an era before antibiotics, and surgery within the abdominal cavity was incredibly risky. But the alternative was almost certain death from peritonitis. The decision to operate was a monumental gamble. On one hand, it was the king's only chance for survival. On the other, if he were to die on the operating table just days before his coronation, the political and constitutional crisis would be unimaginable. The news was kept a tightly guarded secret for as long as possible, but the official announcement, when it came, was a seismic shock. A notice was posted confirming that the coronation, scheduled for June 26th, was indefinitely postponed. The public reaction was a mixture of profound sympathy and utter bewilderment. For the first time, a coronation was being canceled not by political revolt or public scandal, but by a medical condition most people had never even heard of. Whispers and wild rumors filled the newspapers. Some speculated it was a cover for something more serious, perhaps a nervous breakdown or a venereal disease, a nod to the king's rakish reputation. Others saw it as a terrible omen, a sign that his reign was cursed from the start. The very word appendicitis became a topic of intense public discussion, a strange new medical term entering the popular lexicon through royal misfortune. Behind the scenes, the logistical fallout was nothing short of catastrophic. The machinery of state, which had been meticulously building towards a single, precise moment, now had to be thrown into reverse. Telegrams were frantically sent across the globe, informing foreign heads of state that their journeys had been for nothing. Elaborate travel and accommodation arrangements for hundreds of royal guests had to be unraveled. The specially commissioned robes and uniforms, the caterers preparing vast banquets, the military units rehearsing their parade drills, an entire industry built around the coronation was suddenly left in limbo. The economic impact was severe, with hotels, restaurants, and souvenir sellers facing massive losses. The government had to navigate the unprecedented task of rescheduling one of the world's most complex and symbolic events, all while hoping the 59-year-old king would actually recover. For 2 long months, the nation held its breath. Edward's surgery was successful, but his recovery was slow and fraught with anxiety. When the coronation was finally held on August 9th, it was a scaled-back, more subdued affair, stripped of much of its original pageantry. The king was still visibly weak, and the ceremony was shortened at his doctor's insistence to conserve his strength. The triumphant beginning he had envisioned was replaced by a pervasive atmosphere of concern. a shadow of ill health that would linger over the early years of his reign, a constant reminder that even with all the power of an empire at his command, a monarch's most vulnerable point was, and always would be, his own mortal body. After a century of managing everything from medical emergencies to public relations nightmares, the British monarchy faced a new and uniquely 20th century challenge: the unstoppable rise of the motion picture. For the coronation of King George V in 1911, the nation was more excited than ever to witness the ceremony, but not from the streets of London. They wanted to see it in their local cinemas. The new technology of film promised to bring the ancient ritual directly to the masses, allowing every citizen a front row seat to history. Yet this promise of modern connection collided head-on with the monarchy's deep-seated instinct for tradition and control, resulting in a quiet but profound disaster of missed opportunity and public alienation. King George V was a conservative man by nature, a naval officer who valued duty, discipline, and the established order above all else. He viewed the coronation not as a public spectacle, but as a sacred, almost mystical rite of passage, a solemn oath between himself and God that was witnessed by the nation, but not necessarily for the nation's entertainment. When the powerful newsreel companies of the day, like Pathé and Gaumont, petitioned the palace for permission to film inside Westminster Abbey, the king's answer was an immediate and resounding no. His reasoning, as conveyed through his advisors, was rooted in a fear that the presence of cameras, with their noisy mechanisms and glaring lights, would desecrate the holy atmosphere. He was deeply concerned that turning the ceremony into a moving picture would strip it of its dignity, reducing a divine sacrament to the level of a common music hall novelty or a frivolous entertainment. In his mind, the flickering, silent images on a cinema screen could never capture the profound spiritual gravity of the event. They could only ever cheapen it. This decision, however logical it seemed within the bubble of the court, completely failed to grasp the public mood. The early 20th century was the dawn of the visual age. The newspapers were filled with photographs, and cinemas were springing up on every high street, becoming the most popular form of mass entertainment. For the first time, ordinary people had a tangible, visual connection to world events. The public had been captivated by newsreel footage of everything from sporting events to distant wars, and they fully expected to see their new king crowned in the same vivid detail. The palace's refusal was therefore met not with respectful understanding, but with widespread disappointment and a palpable sense of frustration. It felt like a deliberate snub, an act of aristocratic exclusion. The monarchy was refusing to let the people see their own national ceremony, as if the working classes were not deemed worthy of a close-up view. Editorials in newspapers questioned the decision, and a general feeling simmered that the new king was out of touch, clinging to an outdated notion of mystery when the modern world was demanding transparency and inclusion. Behind the velvet ropes and palace gates, a fierce battle was raging. The newsreel companies, recognizing the immense commercial and historical value of the footage, were not giving up without a fight. They lobbied government officials and leveraged their contacts within the royal household, arguing that filming the coronation was a patriotic duty. They insisted that allowing the empire's subjects from Canada to Australia to see the ceremony would strengthen imperial bonds in a way no printed description ever could. They even proposed technical solutions to appease the king's concerns, offering to use specially muffled cameras and to position their operators in discreet, pre-approved locations where they would cause minimal disruption. But the king, backed by traditionalist courtiers and the Archbishop of Canterbury, remained unmovable. The sacred space of the abbey, he decreed, was inviolable. No compromise could be reached. The only concession made was to allow a single official photographer to take still pictures at certain moments, a paltry substitute for the living, breathing drama of film. The consequence of this stubborn resistance was a public relations fiasco. On Coronation Day, while the ceremony unfolded in its unseen splendor inside the abbey, the newsreels had to make do with what they could get from the outside. They captured splendid footage of the processions, the gleaming carriages, and the cheering crowds. But the heart of the event, the anointing, the crowning, the moment of oath, remained a hidden secret, known only to the privileged few in attendance. When the newsreels were shown in cinemas in the following days, they felt incomplete, like a trailer for a film the public was never allowed to see. The king, in his effort to preserve the mystery and sanctity of the monarchy, had instead created a void, one that was filled with public resentment and a growing sense that the institution was retreating from the modern world. This was a disaster of perception. While there was no fire, no fumbled crown, and no trampled citizens, the monarchy had suffered a different kind of wound. It had voluntarily given up the most powerful tool yet invented for building a personal, emotional connection with its people, choosing instead to remain a distant, ceremonial silhouette, forever seen from afar, but never truly brought into focus. It was a critical miscalculation that highlighted a recurring royal blind spot, the failure to understand that in a democratic age, the crown's survival depends not just on tradition, but on its ability to be seen, understood, and embraced by the public it serves. But just as the monarchy seemed to be finding its footing in the modern media landscape, a new and utterly unexpected crisis emerged, one that threatened to unravel the very fabric of British unity on the eve of its most important ceremony. The year was 1953, and the entire nation was preparing for the coronation of a young Queen Elizabeth II, a beacon of hope and renewal after the grim years of war. The plans were meticulous, the guest list global, and the event was to be the first coronation ever televised, a conscious effort to learn from the mistakes of the past and bring the monarchy directly into the homes of the people. Yet, lurking beneath this carefully constructed pageantry was a deep, historical wound that few in London seemed to fully appreciate. A wound that was about to be violently reopened. For this coronation, unlike any other in history, almost took place without one of its most sacred and non-negotiable props, the Stone of Scone. To understand the sheer magnitude of this potential disaster, you have to understand what the Stone of Scone represented. This was not merely a decorative block of sandstone. For centuries, it had been the sacred coronation seat of the ancient kings of Scotland, housed in the monastery of Scone Abbey near Perth. Scottish legend held that it was the very stone upon which Jacob rested his head at Bethel, a biblical relic that had traveled from the Holy Land to Ireland, then to Scotland, imbuing it with an almost mystical authority. To be crowned upon it was to receive the divine right to rule the Scottish people. Its importance made it a prime target for England's King Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots. In 1296, after a brutal military campaign, he seized the stone as a prize of war, forcibly removing it from Scone and carrying it south to London. There, he had a special coronation chair built to encase it, ensuring that every English and later British monarch would be crowned symbolically sitting upon the subjugated kingdom of Scotland. For over 650 years, it remained in Westminster Abbey, a silent, powerful, and deeply resented symbol of English domination. This simmering resentment finally boiled over on Christmas Day, 1950. While the city of London slept off its holiday celebrations, a small team of 4 Scottish nationalist students from the University of Glasgow executed a breathtakingly audacious plan. They broke into Westminster Abbey, located the coronation chair, and managed to pry the 152-kilogram stone from its wooden housing. In the process, the ancient stone broke into 2 pieces. Undeterred, they bundled the heavy fragments into the trunk of their car and drove north, eventually hiding their prize and issuing a statement declaring that the stone had been liberated and returned to its rightful home. The news, when it broke, caused absolute pandemonium. In Scotland, there was widespread, if quiet, celebration. The daring act was seen by many as a heroic gesture of national pride. In London, the government and the establishment were thrown into a state of profound embarrassment and panic. The police launched a massive manhunt, borders were watched, and the press had a field day, but the stone had simply vanished. For the next 4 months, the stone remained missing, and as the planning for the new Queen's coronation in 1953 intensified, the situation became a full-blown constitutional crisis. The coronation oath specifically referenced the United Kingdoms of Great Britain, and the physical act of being crowned while seated above the stone of Scone was a crucial part of that symbolism. To hold the ceremony without it would be an unthinkable admission that the union was broken, a propaganda victory for Scottish nationalists, and a global humiliation for the British state. Behind the scenes, frantic, top-secret negotiations were initiated. The government, desperate to avoid a public confrontation, could not be seen to be negotiating with thieves, so intermediaries and sympathetic Scottish politicians worked as go-betweens. The message was clear and urgent. The stone had to be returned, and it had to be returned in time for the coronation. The pressure was immense, and it culminated in a clandestine operation that would feel at home in a spy novel. In April 1951, the stone was discovered, carefully draped in a Scottish saltire, on the altar of the ruined Arbroath Abbey, a site of immense nationalist significance as the place where Scottish nobles had once declared their independence from England. Its return, however, was anything but a simple surrender. A deal had been struck. The nationalists had made their point spectacularly, and the government, in a major concession, agreed that after the coronation, the stone would no longer be treated as a mere trophy. It was a face-saving compromise for both sides. The stone was officially recovered by the police and quietly returned to Westminster Abbey, where it was secretly repaired by skilled stonemasons before being placed back beneath the coronation chair. When Queen Elizabeth II was crowned on June 2, 1953, the television cameras focused on her serene face, completely unaware of the frantic political thriller that had just played out behind the velvet curtains. She took her oath as the ruler of the United Kingdom, seated upon the reunited stone, its presence assuring the world of a union intact. But the genie of Scottish nationalism, once so powerfully released, could not be so easily put back in its bottle. The theft had exposed a raw nerve, proving that even the most ancient and seemingly secure symbols of power could be vulnerable, and that the pageantry of the crown could, in an instant, be hijacked by a bold act of political theater. Yet despite the political triumph of recovering the Stone of Scone, the elements themselves seemed to conspire against the coronation, presenting a challenge that no amount of planning or diplomacy could control. On the morning of June 2nd, 1953, London awoke not to a brilliant summer day fit for a queen, but to a sky the color of lead and a persistent, chilling drizzle that would soon intensify into a relentless downpour. The glorious, sun-drenched spectacle the nation had envisioned was instantly replaced by a damp, gray reality. For the millions of people who had camped out overnight along the procession route, their spirit and patriotism were about to be tested against the sheer, miserable force of a British summer. They huddled under umbrellas and waterproof capes, their picnic blankets soaked, their festive spirits dampened, but not entirely broken. The weather was not just an inconvenience, it was an active participant in the day's drama, transforming the grand military parade into a test of endurance and threatening to undermine the very first live broadcast of a coronation in history. The procession itself became a spectacle of stoic determination, pitted against the pouring rain. Soldiers from across the Commonwealth, resplendent in their pristine dress uniforms, found the bright red of the guards' tunics and the brilliant polish on their brass buttons slowly succumbing to the weather. Plumes on bearskin hats drooped sadly. Heavy wool uniforms absorbed the damp until they weighed double, and the horses, trained for every eventuality, tossed their heads nervously as the cold water streamed down their flanks. The rain fell in sheets, obscuring the view of the Golden State coach and turning the streets into reflective rivers. And yet, the discipline of the armed forces held fast. They marched with unwavering precision, their boots splashing through puddles in perfect unison, a display of order that stood in stark, almost poignant contrast to the chaotic weather. The crowds, equally drenched, cheered all the louder, their voices rising above the drumming of the rain on a million umbrellas, creating a shared, defiant camaraderie between the spectators and the participants. This wasn't the perfect picture postcard day they had hoped for, but in a way, the adversity made it more authentically British and perhaps more meaningful. A celebration not of fair weather patriotism, but of a deep, enduring resolve. Inside the BBC's makeshift broadcasting center, however, the downpour was a source of pure, unadulterated anxiety. This was the single most ambitious outside broadcast ever attempted, and the new and fragile television technology was being pushed to its absolute limits. The downpour created a logistical nightmare for the camera crews positioned along the route and on the rooftops surrounding the Abbey. Camera lenses were constantly spotted with raindrops, requiring technicians to repeatedly and frantically wipe them clear with cloths, often missing crucial, unrepeatable shots in the process. The poor light conditions forced cameramen to open their apertures wider, resulting in a shallower depth of field and making it harder to keep fast-moving subjects in sharp focus. There was a very real fear that the entire broadcast, this historic moment of bringing the monarchy into the nation's homes, would be a murky, blurred, and technically flawed disappointment. The director in the control truck, a pioneer named Peter Dimick, was faced with a cascade of difficult decisions. He had to constantly switch between camera feeds, desperately searching for the clearest shot, often choosing a more distant camera that was slightly more sheltered from the rain over a closer one that was being battered by the storm. The sound engineers battled to isolate the majestic sounds of the ceremony and the cheering crowds from the constant, distracting static hiss of rainfall hitting their microphones. It was a high-wire act, a live performance with no safety net and no possibility of a second take. The world was watching, and the pressure to deliver a clear, dignified, and seamless broadcast was immense, a burden made infinitely heavier by the uncooperative weather. The success of this televised coronation was crucial for the future of the monarchy's relationship with the public. And for a few tense hours, it all hinged on the skill of a few dozen technicians fighting a losing battle against the elements. And yet, in a strange and unexpected way, the terrible weather may have ultimately enhanced the broadcast rather than ruined it. The gray, rain-washed light, while a technical challenge, lent the images a certain stark gravitas. It stripped away any potential for gaudy spectacle and replaced it with a more intimate, almost documentary-like realism. When the cameras finally found their mark inside the abbey, the contrast was breathtaking. They cut from the damp, windswept chaos of the streets to the serene, golden-hued interior of Westminster, a world of glittering jewels, rich velvet, and reverent silence. That dramatic shift from the raw human effort outside to the timeless, sacred ritual within was far more powerful than a simple sunny procession could ever have been. It framed the coronation not as a distant, untouchable fairy tale, but as a profound national event that was earned through shared hardship. The rain-soaked crowds and the stoic soldiers became an integral part of the story, proving that the true glory of the day lay not in the perfection of the weather, but in the unwavering commitment of a people to witness history, come rain or shine. While the rain and the recovered stone of Scone presented their own dramas, the most heart-stopping moment of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation was one the television cameras almost missed, a fleeting incident during the ceremony's most sacred and secret core, the anointing. This part of the coronation is so deeply personal and spiritually profound that it has been hidden from public view for centuries. Considered a moment of communion between the monarch and God, far too holy for the eyes of spectators. Even for the pioneering 1953 broadcast, the decision was made to drape a golden canopy over the young queen, shielding her from the cameras as the Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ancient rite. The television audience saw only the ornate cloth being held aloft by 4 Knights of the Garter, creating a small, private sanctuary in the midst of the vast, crowded abbey. Inside that sacred space, the Queen's crimson robe was removed, and she sat in a simple white dress, symbolizing purity and humility before the divine. It was at this precise, vulnerable moment that a simple object, a small golden vessel known as the ampulla, nearly caused a disaster that would have overshadowed every other mishap in royal history. The ampulla itself is a masterpiece of medieval goldsmithing, shaped like a golden eagle with outspread wings. According to royal tradition, It was a gift from the Virgin Mary to St. Thomas Becket, and later discovered by the Black Prince at the end of the 14th century. Its purpose is to hold the holy chrism oil used to anoint the sovereign. This isn't just any oil. It is a specially consecrated blend of orange flowers, roses, cinnamon, musk, and ambergris, a recipe that has been used for centuries. The anointing is the theological centerpiece of the entire coronation. It is the moment when the monarch is set apart, blessed and consecrated for the immense burden of service, mirroring the biblical anointings of kings and priests in the Old Testament. For believers, it is the point where the human being is transformed into the Lord's anointed, a spiritual metamorphosis that invests the sovereign with a sacred, almost priestly, character. The gravity of this act cannot be overstated. It is the very foundation of the monarch's spiritual authority. It was the solemn duty of the Dean of Westminster, the Very Reverend Alan Donne, to present this priceless, sacred vessel to the Archbishop. The ceremony had been rehearsed for months, every movement choreographed to perfection. But on the day, under the immense pressure of the occasion and the gaze of the world, something went terribly wrong. As Dean Donne stepped forward to hand the ampulla to the Archbishop, Geoffrey Fisher, his hands, perhaps damp with nervous perspiration or simply faltering under the weight of the moment, lost their grip. The solid gold eagle, containing the very essence of the coronation ritual, slipped. For a horrifying second, it was in free fall, tumbling towards the stone floor of the abbey. A collective, silent gasp seemed to freeze the entire congregation. If the ampulla had struck the ground, it could have shattered, spilling the holy oil and desecrating the most solemn moment of the ceremony. The symbolic rupture would have been catastrophic, interpreted by many as a terrible omen for the new reign, a sign of divine disfavor at the very instant it was being sought. What happened next was a miracle of reflexes and sheer presence of mind. Archbishop Fisher, who was standing ready to receive the vessel, did not freeze. In a split-second instinctive move, he shot his hands out and caught the ampulla mid-air, preventing it from hitting the ground. The crisis was averted in a heartbeat. The ceremony continued without a visible pause, the golden canopy still shielding the Queen from view. The television cameras, of course, did not capture this near disaster, as their view was blocked by the canopy. But a single still photograph, taken from an angle that peered into the sacred space, exists. It shows the Archbishop, his face a mask of intense concentration, his hands securely clasping the golden eagle, with the Dean looking on, his own hands still partially outstretched in the aftermath of the fumble. This single image is the only visual proof of a moment that could have derailed the entire spiritual legitimacy of the event. The significance of this near catastrophe resonates on multiple levels. On a purely practical level, it highlights the immense human pressure inherent in these ancient rituals. Even the most devout and practiced individuals are susceptible to a momentary lapse, a tremble of the hand that could, in an instant, undo centuries of tradition. It reminds us that for all the planning and precision, these ceremonies are performed by fallible people, not automatons. More profoundly, the incident speaks to the fragile nature of symbolic power itself. The entire coronation is built upon a foundation of unbroken ritual and sacred objects. The ampulla isn't just a container. It is a tangible link to a mythical past and a vessel of divine grace. Had it been broken, the physical rupture would have created a metaphysical crisis, a crack in the very narrative of continuity and divine sanction that the monarchy relies upon. The fact that it was saved, and by the very man whose role it was to use its contents, was instantly woven into the coronation story not as a failure, but as a testament to providential intervention. It became a quiet, behind-the-scenes drama of salvation, a moment where human error was caught by human quickness, allowing the sacred mystery to proceed and the new queen to be anointed, not with spilled oil, but with the uninterrupted blessing of a tradition that had quite literally been saved from falling. So far, we've seen what happens when the pageantry of the crown goes wrong on its own turf, within the hallowed walls of Westminster Abbey or the grand squares of Moscow. But there is another kind of coronation, one that played out not in a cathedral, but in a drawing room, not with a scepter, but with a marriage certificate. This was the world of the Gilded Age heiress, a young American woman from a world of railroads, steel, and staggering new wealth, for whom a royal title was the ultimate, glittering prize. For these women, marrying a European prince or duke was their coronation day, a ritual of social ascent that promised to transform them from mere millionaires' daughters into genuine royalty. Yet this transition was rarely the fairy tale they envisioned. Instead, it was a brutal collision between two fundamentally different worlds: the dynamic, ambitious, and often brash culture of American new money, and the ancient, rigid, and deeply snobbish traditions of the European aristocracy. Imagine the scene from the American perspective. The late 19th century was the age of the robber barons, men like Cornelius Vanderbilt and William Backhouse Astor, who had built financial empires so vast they dwarfed the treasuries of many European nations. Their daughters grew up in palatial Fifth Avenue mansions and Newport cottages that were, in reality, marble-clad palaces, surrounded by every material comfort imaginable. But what they lacked was status. In the fiercely democratic but socially stratified United States, their money was too new, their names too recently added to the ledger. They were excluded from the innermost circles of New York's old money establishment, a slight that stung their ambitious parents deeply. A European title, therefore, was the ultimate validation, a way to purchase the one thing their millions could not automatically buy: centuries of lineage and unquestioned social precedence. It was a business transaction, yes, but one draped in the romantic language of royalty, a deal that promised to crown their family name with the ultimate seal of approval. On the other side of the Atlantic, the situation was equally transactional, but born of desperation rather than ambition. Vast, crumbling ancestral estates like Blenheim Palace or Chatsworth were becoming impossible to maintain. The agricultural depression of the late 1800s had decimated land-based incomes, while the ancient codes of nobility prevented these titled aristocrats from engaging in anything as vulgar as trade. They had the names, the castles, and the lineage stretching back to the Norman conquest, but they were running out of cash. An American heiress represented a financial rescue package disguised in a ball gown. Her multi-million-dollar dowry, often equivalent to tens or even hundreds of millions in today's money, could re-slate the roofs, restore the art collections, and secure the family's position for another generation. The prince got the funds to sustain his lifestyle, the heiress got the title to crown her social ambitions. It seemed, on paper, like the perfect arrangement. But the reality of this new life was a profound cultural shock that no amount of money could fully cushion. These young American women, raised with a degree of independence and outspokenness that was unthinkable in European high society, suddenly found themselves imprisoned by a labyrinth of etiquette and expectation. They were expected to be seen and not heard, to defer absolutely to their husbands and their formidable new mothers-in-law, and to subsume their entire identity into the service of the family name. Their wealth, the very reason they were brought there, was also a source of constant, sneering ridicule. They were nicknamed the Dollar Princesses, and their every attempt to fit in was scrutinized and mocked. Their clothes were too lavish, their accents too sharp, their manners too informal. They had purchased a crown, but they discovered it came with a set of invisible, unbreakable chains. The coronation into this ancient aristocracy was not a triumphant ascension to a throne, but a consignment to a gilded cage, where the price of admission was their fortune, their freedom, and very often, their happiness. This clash of cultures, this fundamental mismatch between New World dynamism and Old World rigidity, set the stage for a different kind of coronation disaster, one of heartbreaking loneliness, social humiliation, and quiet, desperate rebellion behind the palace walls. And so we arrive at one of the most heartbreaking and starkly transactional of these social coronations, the story of a young woman whose wedding day was not a celebration, but a public performance of private despair. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and in the autumn of 1895, at just 18 years old, she became the ultimate prize in the marriage market. Her hand traded for one of the most illustrious titles in all of England, the Duke of Marlborough. This was not a union born of affection, but a chillingly deliberate merger of American industrial fortune and British aristocratic decay, orchestrated with the iron will of her mother, the formidable Alva Vanderbilt. To understand the sheer force behind this arrangement, you must first understand Alva. She was a social climber of breathtaking ambition, a woman who had fought her way into New York's highest echelons by building the most opulent mansion on Fifth Avenue and throwing the most extravagant costume ball the city had ever seen. Yet, even after achieving this, a ceiling remained. The old money, Knickerbocker families still looked down their noses at the Vanderbilts, whose wealth came from railroads and shipping, considered vulgar and new. For Alva, a British dukedom was the ultimate weapon to shatter that ceiling forever. It was more than a title. It was a social nuclear option. So she set her sights on Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The Duke, known as Sonny for his title, not his disposition, was the perfect candidate. He was the owner of Blenheim Palace, one of England's largest and most magnificent stately homes, a Baroque masterpiece that was quite literally crumbling around him. The roof leaked, the art collections were mortgaged, and the vast estates were struggling. He needed a massive infusion of cash, and Alva Vanderbilt had it. The courtship was a brutally efficient negotiation, with Consuelo as the principal asset. Alva controlled every aspect, isolating her daughter and presenting the Duke as the only possible future. Consuelo, a gentle and sensitive girl, was in love with an American suitor, Winthrop Rutherford, a match her mother found wholly unacceptable. What followed was a campaign of emotional coercion that, by modern standards, was nothing short of abusive. Alva, upon discovering the secret romance, locked Consuelo in her room, separating her from her beloved and subjecting her to relentless pressure. In a final dramatic act of manipulation, Alva, who had a history of heart trouble, claimed that her daughter's disobedience would be the death of her, collapsing onto a chaise lounge and declaring she would go to her grave if Consuelo refused the dupe. Trapped, isolated, and fearing she would literally kill her mother, the 18-year-old Consuelo finally surrendered. Her spirit was broken. The deal was struck. In exchange for the Duchess's title, the Vanderbilts would provide a dowry that, in today's money, would exceed $100 million, along with an astronomical annual allowance, all to save the illustrious House of Marlborough from financial ruin. The wedding day itself, November 6, 1895, should have been the pinnacle of a young woman's life. Instead, it was a somber pageant of misery. Consuelo was dressed in a legendary gown of white satin and a 10-foot-long train, her face veiled by the famed pearl and diamond necklace known as the Regent, a final glittering symbol of the fortune she represented. But as she walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, observers noted that her eyes were red and swollen from a night of crying. She wept openly throughout the ceremony, her tears soaking into the delicate lace of her veil. The Duke, for his part, was a cold and distant figure, playing his part in a transaction he felt was beneath his ancient lineage, but essential for his survival. The press, of course, portrayed it as the wedding of the century, a fairy tale union of American beauty and British nobility. The public saw the glitter and the gold. They did not see the young bride's heart breaking with every step she took toward the altar. This was her coronation, and it felt more like a funeral for her own dreams. The reality of life as the Duchess of Marlborough was a profound and lonely disappointment. Arriving at Blenheim Palace, she found it to be a cold, drafty, and impersonal monument, more a museum than a home. Her husband, Sonny, made little effort to connect with her emotionally. He was often dismissive and condescending, embarrassed by her American origins and resenting the financial dependency her money created. Their marriage was a contractual obligation, and it remained one in the most intimate sense. Consuelo later confessed in her memoirs that the marriage was never consummated for some time, and when they did have 2 sons, heirs to secure the Marlborough line, it was a duty performed without affection. She was trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by unimaginable splendor but starved of warmth and love. Her role was to host lavish parties, to wear the famous Marlborough jewels, and to be the beautiful, silent ornament that validated the entire arrangement. The scandal of their unhappiness was not a loud, public affair, but a quiet, persistent whisper that ran through the drawing rooms of both England and America. It was the open secret of the Gilded Age. The most brilliant marriage of the era was a spectacular and spectacularly sad failure. Consuelo Vanderbilt had gained a coronet, but she had lost herself, a poignant and powerful reminder that the heaviest crowns are often those forged not in gold, but in obligation and despair. But even for a duchess like Consuelo, who had successfully navigated the altar, the social battles were far from over. The world she entered was governed by an unwritten code of exclusion, so subtle and so brutal that it could turn a coronation, the grandest event of all, into a personal and very public humiliation. For these American heiresses, an invitation to a coronation was more than just a ticket to a ceremony. It was their final official report card, a definitive judgment on whether their expensive new titles had truly bought them acceptance into the innermost sanctum of the British aristocracy. And more often than not, the result was a stinging snub that laid bare the unbridgeable gap between their wealth and their perceived worth. No one understood this precarious social position better than Jenny Jerome, the formidable mother of Winston Churchill. Decades before Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage, Jenny, the beautiful and brilliant daughter of a New York financier, had married Lord Randolph Churchill, the younger son of the Duke of Marlborough. She was one of the first and most prominent of the dollar princesses, a woman of immense charm, intelligence, and force of personality. She mastered British politics as a confidante and campaigner for her husband. She charmed London society with her wit and her salons, and she became a fixture in the highest circles. Yet, for all her influence and her decades of life in England, she remained, in the eyes of the ancient landed families, an outsider. Her money was American, her blood was considered common, and her vibrancy was often seen as a threat to the more staid and traditional elements of the court. This lingering status as a permanent guest, never quite a full member of the family, was never more apparent than during the coronation of King Edward VII in 1902. Jenny, by then a widow and a powerful social figure in her own right, fully expected to receive a prime invitation. She had, after all, been at the heart of the Prince of Wales's social set for years, a member of his prestigious Marlborough House set. But when the official invitations were issued, she found herself facing a devastating omission. She was not invited to witness the ceremony from the prestigious seats reserved for the highest nobility and the family's closest friends. The reason, though never stated outright, was a stark reminder of the rigid hierarchy she could never fully penetrate. As the widow of a younger son of a duke, her own rank was considered insufficient for such an honor. The ancient protocols of precedence, a complex web of titles and birth order that dictated every aspect of court life, had coldly and systematically excluded her. The sting of this rejection was not merely personal. It was a public declaration of her secondary status. In the microcosm of London society, where every social move was watched and dissected, her absence from the Abbey's most coveted seats was a topic of widespread gossip. It was a silent but resonant message to everyone who knew her. You may dine with us, you may entertain us, but at the most sacred and symbolic moment of our national life, you do not belong with us. For a woman of Jenny's pride and accomplishments, this was a profound social disaster. It underscored the painful truth that her decades of effort, her political influence, and her vibrant personality could not overwrite the simple fact of her American origins and her secondary aristocratic title. The coronation guest list became a weapon, a means of enforcing a social boundary that no amount of money or charm could cross. And Jenny was far from alone. Other American-born peeresses faced similar slights, often orchestrated by the very figures who should have been their greatest allies. Their British mothers-in-law or other senior female relatives who viewed them with suspicion and jealousy. A duchess from Pittsburgh might find that her invitation to a coronation ball was lost, or that her seat at the ceremony was positioned behind a pillar, far from the view of the cameras and the important guests. These were not accidents. They were deliberate acts of social sabotage designed to put the ambitious newcomers in their place. In a world where proximity to the monarch was the ultimate measure of social standing, being physically marginalized at a coronation was a devastating blow. It was a graphic illustration of their place in the pecking order, a reminder that they were decorative accessories to the aristocracy, not integral parts of its foundation. The agony of these exclusions was magnified by the sheer global spectacle a coronation had become. Newspapers would print the full guest list, and society columns would breathlessly report on who was seen where and who was wearing which tiara. For the heiress who was left off that list, or whose name appeared far down in the accounting, the humiliation was not a private affair. It was splashed across the front pages of the very American newspapers her family had sought to impress. The message sent back to New York and Newport was clear. All that money, and you still weren't good enough for the royal inner circle. This public marking of their outsider status was the very antithesis of why they had crossed the Atlantic in the first place. They had embarked on this journey to gain acceptance, to crown their social ascent with a title that commanded universal respect. Instead, at the moment of the monarchy's grandest celebration, they were often handed a painful lesson in the limits of their purchased prestige, a reminder that the oldest and most guarded clubs in the world do not sell lifetime memberships. They only sometimes rent out rooms. For these aristocratic women, the grand state ball or the formal presentation at court was their equivalent of a coronation day. It was their moment in the spotlight, a ritual of social validation where every detail of their appearance was a strategic declaration of their family's wealth, status, and taste. And at the heart of this intricate social armor was the tiara, a glittering symbol of rank that was meant to project an image of unshakable, inherited composure. But when that armor failed, the result was not just a simple mishap. It was a social catastrophe that could echo through the ballrooms of Europe for years, turning a triumph of status into a spectacle of humiliation. Consider the sheer physics of the situation. These were not lightweight costume jewels. A full parure consisting of a tiara, necklace, earrings, and stomacher could weigh several pounds, constructed from solid silver or gold and set with hundreds of densely packed diamonds. The frames of the tiaras themselves, though ornate, were often surprisingly fragile, held together by tiny clasps and age-weakened solder points. They were designed for the gentle, measured movements of a portrait sitting, not for the vigorous turning of the head during conversation, the slight bump from a passing guest, or the simple, relentless pull of gravity over the course of a long, hot evening. A sudden, inadvertent turn while dancing a waltz could be all it took to compromise a century-old setting. The horror would begin not with a loud crash, but with a subtle, sickening shift in weight, a faint prickle of cold metal on the scalp, or the terrifying sight of a single diamond dropping silently into a lady's lap. In that frozen moment, she would face an impossible choice: continue as if nothing had happened, risking a complete and very public collapse of her regalia, or make a frantic, undignified retreat, drawing every eye in the room to her malfunctioning magnificence. The anecdotes of these disasters are the stuff of aristocratic nightmare fuel. One of the most famously recounted tales involves a young American heiress, newly married into the British peerage, who was wearing her mother-in-law's prized diamond tiara for the first time at a ball at Buckingham Palace. Eager to make a good impression, she had practiced her curtsy and her conversational pleasantries for weeks. What she could not have practiced for was the precarious state of the antique piece. As she ascended the grand staircase, nodding gracefully to acquaintances, she felt a sudden lurch. The central, most important diamond cluster of the tiara, loosened by decades of wear, detached completely. It did not fall to the floor. Instead, it swung down on its almost invisible settings, dangling directly in front of her face like a glittering, accusing pendulum. She was forced to spend the entire evening conversing with a bobbing, diamond nosegay obscuring her vision, too terrified to touch it for fear of causing further damage, and unable to leave without creating the very scene she was desperate to avoid. Her debut was not remembered for her beauty or her poise, but for the comical yet deeply humiliating malfunction of her most important accessory. Then there were the dangers of the court train, another essential component of full evening dress for presentations. These were not mere strips of fabric. They were massive, heavy swaths of velvet, silk, or brocade, often several yards long and lined with ermine, designed to sweep dramatically behind their wearer. The protocol for managing one was a complex dance in itself, but in a crowded throne room, packed with other women navigating their own cumbersome trains, disaster was a constant possibility. There are numerous accounts of trains being trodden on by clumsy ambassadors, causing the wearer to be jerked backward mid-curtsy. Even worse was the dreaded sound of tearing silk, a noise that could cut through the murmur of polite conversation and bring a hush to a section of the room. One countess, presented at the court of St. James's, had the delicate lace flounce at the end of her train catch on the heel of her own shoe. With each step forward, she unknowingly unraveled several inches of priceless family heirloom lace, leaving a trail of delicate thread on the polished palace floor until a horrified equerry finally rushed to discreetly inform her of the destruction in her wake. The social fallout from these regalia malfunctions was immediate and brutal. In a world where reputation was everything, a broken tiara or a torn train was not seen as an accident of physics, but as a character flaw. It was interpreted as carelessness, a lack of respect for tradition, or most damning of all, a sign that the family's fortunes were so precarious they could not even maintain their own jewels. The whispers would start instantly. Perhaps the settings were weak because they couldn't afford to have them serviced. Or, she clearly isn't used to wearing pieces of that quality. For an American heiress, it was the ultimate confirmation of every snobbish prejudice held against her, that her money was new and her grace was learned, not innate. The memory of the event would be dredged up at future social gatherings for years, a permanent stain on her social record. In the relentless theater of high society, where every woman was both actor and critic, a wardrobe malfunction was more than a personal embarrassment. It was a public demotion, a moment when the glittering facade of aristocracy cracked to reveal the very human anxiety and fallibility it was designed to conceal. And then there were the coronations that never happened at all, the royal futures that were snatched away not by a dropped crown or a sudden illness, but by a scandal whispered in a drawing room or a telegram of disapproval from a foreign palace. For every Consuelo Vanderbilt who endured a miserable marriage for a title, there was another American heiress who came achingly close to royalty, only to have her potential crown publicly and painfully revoked. Their broken engagements were, in the brutal theater of high society, a form of anti-coronation, a very public uncrowning before they ever had the chance to ascend the throne. The story of Catherine Elkins stands as one of the most poignant examples of this particular kind of social disaster. A drama where the prize was an Italian prince and the antagonist was the most powerful woman in the world, her own future mother-in-law. Catherine Elkins was the epitome of gilded age, grace, and privilege. The daughter of a United States senator and wealthy coal magnate Stephen B. Elkins, she was raised at the magnificent estate of Hallihurst in West Virginia, a home so vast it was known as the Summer White House. She was beautiful, intelligent, fluent in several languages, and immensely wealthy. By all accounts, she was a perfect candidate for a brilliant transatlantic match. In 1906, she caught the eye of Prince Luigi Amadeo, the Duke of the Abruzzi, a man who was in his own right a romantic and dashing figure. He was a renowned explorer, a naval commander, and a member of the Italian royal house of Savoy. Their courtship was a transatlantic whirlwind played out in the newspapers, which were utterly captivated by the pairing of the handsome, adventurous prince and the elegant American heiress. To the public, it seemed a love match for the ages, a union of New World vitality and Old World heroism. For Catherine, this was it. She was on the cusp of becoming a princess, her coronation into European royalty seemingly assured. But there was a formidable, immovable obstacle standing between Catherine and her fairy tale ending, Queen Margherita of Italy. The Queen Mother was a staunch traditionalist, the very embodiment of rigid European court protocol. She had spent a lifetime cultivating the dignity and insular purity of the Savoy dynasty, and the idea of her son, a prince of the blood, marrying a commoner, and an American commoner at that, was utterly unacceptable to her. It did not matter that the Elkins family was wealthy, powerful, and respectable by American standards. In the Queen's eyes, they were still in trade. Their fortune came from coal and railways, not from ancient estates and centuries of noble bloodlines. The Queen wielded her influence with ruthless precision, applying immense pressure on her son and leveraging her connections within the Italian government. She argued that such a morganatic marriage, a union between a person of royal blood and a partner of lower rank, would be a constitutional crisis and a stain on the royal house. The prince, torn between his affections and his duty to the crown, found himself trapped. The engagement, which had been all but official in the American press, was thrown into a state of agonizing limbo. The unraveling was a slow, public, and deeply humiliating spectacle. What had once been breathless, positive coverage in the newspapers began to curdle. Gossip columns, likely fed by sources close to the Italian court, began to question the validity of the engagement. They printed insinuations about the Elkins family's social standing and highlighted the Queen's vehement opposition. Catherine and her family were left in an impossible position, forced to deny rumors and maintain a facade of dignity while their private heartbreak became front-page news. The uncertainty stretched on for months, a torturous period where Catherine was the subject of global pity and fascination. She was the woman who was almost a princess, a title that carried its own unique sting. Finally, the blow fell. Without a formal announcement, it became clear that the engagement was off. The prince, bowing to royal and political pressure, withdrew. He would never marry, dedicating the rest of his life to his explorations, while Catherine's own prospects were irrevocably damaged. The social aftermath for Catherine Elkins was devastating. In the ruthless calculus of high society, a failed engagement of this magnitude was a catastrophic mark against a young woman's reputation. It wasn't just a personal heartbreak, it was a public failure. She had been weighed and measured by the highest possible standard and found wanting. The whispers followed her everywhere. Had she been too forward? Was her family's money not as impressive as it seemed? The very qualities that had made her an attractive match, her intelligence, her wealth, her American confidence, were now retrospectively framed as liabilities. She became a cautionary tale, a symbol of the limits of American ambition. While she eventually married well, wedding a wealthy and respectable businessman, it was seen as a consolation prize, a retreat from the glittering heights she had almost scaled. Her coronation had been canceled, and the world had watched it happen, making her one of the most famous and tragic examples of a dream dashed not by a lack of love or means, but by the unyielding gatekeepers of ancient royalty. Catherine Elkins was far from alone in this particular form of social execution. Just a few years earlier, another American beauty, Gladys Vanderbilt, the sister of the famously miserable Consuelo, found her own romantic aspirations crushed by the same forces of royal disapproval. Gladys was considered the more artistic and free-spirited of the Vanderbilt sisters, and she fell deeply in love with a Hungarian count, Laszlo Széchenyi. While he was a nobleman, he was not a prince, and one might think the stakes would be lower. But the Vanderbilt family, perhaps stung by the transactional nature of Consuelo's marriage or wary of further foreign entanglements, vehemently opposed the match. They saw the Count as a fortune hunter and feared losing another daughter to the gilded cages of Europe. The family pressure was immense, a mirror of the royal pressure that shattered Catherine Elkins's engagement. Gladys's hopes were systematically dismantled by her own family, who used their financial power and social influence to separate the couple. Her coronation into the Hungarian aristocracy was called off by a domestic decree, proving that the forces of tradition and disapproval could be just as potent when they emanated from a Fifth Avenue mansion as from a royal palace. The weaponization of the press in these social dramas cannot be overstated. For the heiresses, the newspapers were both their heralds and their executioners. Initially, they would be built up as fairy tale heroines, their every movement chronicled with breathless admiration. But the moment an engagement showed signs of strain, that same machinery would turn against them with terrifying speed. Headlines would shift from American Beauty to Wed Prince, to Royal Romance on the Rocks, and finally, to the grimly definitive No Wedding Bells for Heiress. The narrative was always framed as a failure on the part of the American woman. She was too modern, too independent, or her blood was too common. The profound cultural snobbery and the complex political pressures of the European courts were rarely examined in depth. The simple, salacious story of the rejected bride was far easier to sell. This media storm amplified the humiliation exponentially, turning a private sorrow into a global talking point. These women weren't just losing a potential husband. They were losing their reputations on an international stage, their names becoming synonymous with social overreach and dashed ambition. Their canceled coronations served as a brutal reminder to every other aspiring dollar princess. The path to a title was littered with the very public ruins of those who had come before. And the crown's guardians were always watching, always judging, and always ready to defend their ancient gates from the invading forces of new money. While the world outside the palace gates witnessed grand processions and heard triumphant fanfares, a very different kind of coronation was often unfolding behind the velvet curtains and within the private family apartments. A silent, seething war of etiquette and precedence where the weapons were a subtle arch of an eyebrow, a strategically timed correction, or a devastatingly polite piece. Advice: for an American heiress on her husband's coronation day, the greatest threat was not a fumbled crown or a sudden downpour, but the quiet, implacable disapproval of her mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess. This formidable matriarch had spent decades mastering the labyrinthine rules of courtly conduct, and she viewed her new daughter-in-law not as a beloved addition to the family, but as a foreign object, a potential contaminant to the pristine lineage she had dedicated her life to upholding. The first skirmish in this silent war often began at the very break of dawn, in the private act of dressing. The new Duchess, perhaps still giddy with a sense of occasion, would be presented with the family's most important heirlooms for the ceremony: the official coronation robes, the designated jewels, the specific order of medals and sashes. To the untrained eye, it was a magnificent, if heavy, costume. To the dowager, it was a sacred uniform, and every element was a test. She would glide into the dressing room, a vision of aged authority, and her gaze would immediately settle on what was wrong. "My dear," she might say, her voice like chilled silk, "the mantle is meant to be fastened with the diamond star, not the pearl cluster. The pearl cluster was for my mother-in-law, the 7th Duchess, on a far less significant occasion." This was not helpful guidance. It was a demarcation of territory, a reminder that the new Duchess was merely a temporary custodian of a tradition she could not yet comprehend. The correction, delivered in front of the ladies' maids, was designed to shatter her confidence before she had even left her chambers, establishing the dowager as the ultimate arbiter of what was correct and proper. This subtle sabotage would then extend to the new Duchess's demeanor and physical bearing. As the royal family assembled for the formal procession to the Abbey, the dowager would position herself nearby, her eyes missing nothing. "Try not to grip the train so tightly, my dear," she might murmur, just loud enough for her son and a few key courtiers to hear. "It makes you look nervous." A duchess glides. She does not clutch. Every gesture was scrutinized. A smile deemed too wide or too informal would be met with a faint, disapproving frown. A moment of genuine, awe-struck hesitation at the grandeur of the scene would be interpreted as a lack of breeding. The dowager's goal was to project an image of effortless grace, making the new duchess's every movement feel studied, awkward, and fundamentally unroyal by comparison. She was performing a centuries-old role with the ease of breathing, while her American daughter-in-law was visibly, painfully acting. The most cutting blows, however, were often reserved for the public moments, the very events designed to present a united and glorious family front. During the long ceremony inside the abbey, as the new duchess sat in her appointed place, the dowager might lean over and whisper a critique disguised as concern. "I do hope the archbishop doesn't notice you fidgeting during the anointing. It is the most sacred part. You understand. Stillness is a sign of reverence." This single sentence, dripping with faux solicitude, would instantly transform a moment of profound spiritual significance into one of intense self-consciousness and anxiety. The Duchess would now be hyper-aware of her own body, terrified of committing a sacrilege she hadn't even known existed, all while the Dowager sat beside her, a picture of serene, unshakable piety. Perhaps the cruelest weapon in the Dowager's arsenal was the manipulation of precedence and proximity. At the coronation banquet or ball that evening, the seating arrangements were a meticulously crafted map of social and political power. A new duchess would naturally expect to be seated near her husband, the new duke, at the center of the top table. But a resourceful dowager, working through her network of loyal friends among the Lord Chamberlain's staff, could engineer a devastating separation. The new duchess might find herself placed several seats down, wedged between a minor foreign diplomat and an elderly, deaf bishop, while the dowager, exploiting her status as the mother of the current title holder, secured a prime position directly beside her son. From there, she could engage him in animated, intimate conversation, pointedly excluding his wife and presenting a tableau of a mother-son bond that transcended his new marital alliance. The message to every guest in the room was unmistakable. The real power and the true bloodline resided with the dowager. The new duchess was a decorative and ultimately peripheral accessory. This silent demotion in front of the entire coronation assembly was a humiliation far more potent than any dropped tiara, a clear signal that her coronation into the family was, in the eyes of its most powerful female member, far from complete. But if you think the quiet disapproval of a mother-in-law was a potent weapon, it paled in comparison to the destructive force of a new and rapidly growing institution, the mass circulation newspaper. For the Gilded Age heiress, her coronation into high society was no longer a private affair witnessed by a few hundred aristocrats. It was a public spectacle staged for millions of eager readers, and the press was a merciless, unpredictable audience. The late 19th century saw the explosive rise of the penny press, cheap newspapers that relied on high circulation and therefore sensational stories to drive sales. These publications discovered that the lives of the rich and titled, especially the new, glamorous, and often scandalous American heiresses, were a bottomless well of copy. Their arrival in Europe was not just a social event. It was a media event, and the reporters were not there to offer a gentle welcome. They were there to build up idols for the sole purpose of watching them shatter, turning a woman's most important social debut into a trial by newsprint. The scrutiny began the moment an heiress's ship docked at Liverpool or Le Havre. Reporters would crowd the gangplanks, not to record her thoughtful impressions of the old world, but to inventory her trousseau, to count her trunks, and to pass judgment on her traveling attire. Was it too ostentatious, too modest? Did she seem aloof or overly familiar? Every detail was fodder. Her past, which might have been a closed book in the more discreet circles of New York, was now a public archive to be raided. Reporters would travel to her hometown, digging up stories of her father's business practices, interviewing former servants about the family's domestic habits, and even tracking down old beaux to hint at previous romances. The goal was to construct a narrative, and the most profitable narratives were those of dramatic rise and fall. An heiress could be celebrated in one morning's edition as a vision of modern beauty and grace, only to be vilified that same evening as a crude, social climbing parvenu, all based on a single misstep at a ball or a whispered comment from an anonymous source close to the family. Take the case of Consuelo Vanderbilt's contemporary, May Gowlett. May was the heir to a colossal real estate fortune, making her one of the most eligible women in the world. When she became engaged to the Duke of Roxburgh in 1903, the press descended upon her with an intensity that bordered on mania. Her engagement was presented as the ultimate fairy tale, but the media's attention quickly turned into an inquisition. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic engaged in a relentless comparison between May and her rival heiresses, particularly Consuelo. They dissected her appearance, her mannerisms, and her family's background with a cruelty that was masked as reporting. When she traveled to England for the wedding, her every public appearance was a high-stakes performance. A photograph of her looking momentarily tired or serious could be captioned as evidence of her unhappiness or her unsuitability for the rigors of aristocratic life. The pressure was immense, a constant hum of judgment that turned what should have been a joyous prelude to her new life into a gauntlet of public opinion. The media had crowned her a queen of society, but they held that crown suspended, ready to drop it at the first sign of a stumble. The transatlantic nature of this media frenzy created a uniquely torturous double bind for these women. In the American press, they were often held up as national heroines, symbols of the new world's vitality conquering the stuffy old world. Their wealth was presented not as vulgar, but as a triumphant achievement. Yet, this very portrayal was then used against them by the British press, which would reprint these glowing American accounts with sneering commentary, framing the heiress's confidence as arrogance and her family's pride as boastful vulgarity. An heiress could not win. If she tried to adapt to British reserve, she was accused of being stiff and ungrateful for her American roots. If she displayed her natural American exuberance, she was labeled as loud and unrefined. The press delighted in this cultural dissonance, amplifying every minor social misstep into a major international incident. A simple misunderstanding over a point of etiquette, like using a fish fork for a salad, could become a week-long story about the fundamental incompatibility of American manners with European civilization. Perhaps no one understood the destructive power of the press better than Lady Randolph Churchill, the former Jenny Jerome. Having lived in the public eye for decades, she became a master of managing her own image, but she also witnessed its brutal consequences firsthand. She saw how a single negative paragraph in a society column could close doors that had taken years to open. The press did not just report on society, it actively shaped it, creating and destroying reputations with the stroke of a pen. For a new heiress, this meant that her coronation was not truly in the hands of the Lord Chamberlain or the Queen. It was in the hands of newspaper editors and gossip columnists who were more interested in a sensational story than a social success. Their triumphant entry into society was therefore a perilous high-wire act, performed without a net over a chasm of newsprint, where a single slip could lead to a very public and very permanent fall from grace. But for every American heiress who bought her title with a real fortune, there was another woman who understood that in the theater of high society, perception was everything, and the most valuable currency wasn't gold, but audacity. This is the world of the imposter heiress, a figure who bypassed the need for a massive dowry altogether and instead crafted a crown out of pure, breathtaking fiction. Their stories represent the ultimate inversion of the Gilded Age dream, where the social disaster wasn't a snub or a broken tiara, but the complete and total annihilation of an identity that was never real to begin with. And no one played this dangerous game with more bravado than the legendary con artist Cassie Chadwick. In the early 1900s, Cassie presented herself to the world as the illegitimate daughter of the richest man in America, the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie. This was not a casual rumor she let slip. It was a role she inhabited with the full force of her considerable charisma. She cultivated an aura of immense, almost untouchable wealth, hinting at a secret trust fund worth tens of millions of dollars that would one day be hers. To prove it, she didn't just tell people, she showed them. In a masterstroke of theatrical deception, she arranged to be seen entering Carnegie's New York mansion, emerging sometime later with a promissory note, which she claimed was from the great man himself, made out for a staggering sum. She would then secretly show this note to bankers and financiers, her finger pressed to her lips in a gesture of conspiratorial silence. The effect was electric. If Andrew Carnegie was secretly bankrolling this woman, then her credit was, for all intents and purposes, unlimited. The financial world, always eager to court the super rich, threw its doors open to her. She was welcomed into the best circles in Cleveland and New York, her every whim catered to by bankers who fell over themselves to lend her money, desperate for a piece of the Carnegie fortune they believed was just around the corner. What made Cassie's schemes so effective was her profound understanding of human psychology, particularly the greed and social ambition of the men she targeted. She didn't just ask for small loans. She borrowed vast sums, often hundreds of thousands of dollars, which in today's money would amount to many millions. And she did so while living a life of outrageous luxury, renting entire floors of the most expensive hotels, bedecking herself in diamonds purchased on credit, and hosting lavish parties. This performance was crucial. Her extravagant spending wasn't a liability, it was proof of her legitimacy. In the logic of the Gilded Age, only someone with a truly colossal fortune behind them could possibly spend with such reckless abandon. The bankers saw her bills and saw not debt, but confidence. They weren't just lending to Cassie Chadwick. They were investing in their future connection to the House of Carnegie. She built her throne not on a foundation of money, but on a foundation of their own desperate desire to believe her story. Her uncoronation, when it finally came, was not a quiet affair of private humiliation, but a public explosion that sent shockwaves through the entire American financial system. The end began, as it so often does for fraudsters, with a liquidity crisis. The debts were piling up, and the interest payments were becoming impossible to manage with new loans. In November 1904, a bank in Toledo, Ohio, grew suspicious and decided to call in its loans. Cassie, as always, promised to make good. But this time, the bank's president decided to do what no one else had dared. He contacted Andrew Carnegie's office directly to verify her story. The response from Carnegie's people was swift and absolute. They had never heard of Cassie Chadwick. She was a complete and total fraud. The news hit the financial world like a thunderclap. The bankers who had lent to her, some of the most respected men in their cities, realized in a single, gut-wrenching moment that they had been utterly and completely fooled. They had not been cultivating a relationship with the next Carnegie heiress. They had been bankrolling a brilliant grifter with nothing but nerve. The scene of her arrest was a dramatic, public shaming that served as her final, terrible coronation into infamy. As the news spread, a mob of reporters and angry creditors descended on the hotel where she was staying. When police arrived to take her into custody, they discovered her surrounded by the physical evidence of her deception: trunks filled with expensive gowns, mountains of unpaid bills, and forged documents. But the most damning evidence was the sheer scale of the financial wreckage. It was revealed that she had swindled banks out of what would be tens of millions of dollars today. Her subsequent trial was a national spectacle, a detailed autopsy of her entire fictitious life. Every lie was laid bare, every fabricated document exhibited in court, every duped banker forced to take the stand and explain how he had been so thoroughly deceived. Cassie Chadwick was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison, where she would later die, her glittering persona completely dismantled, her royal pretenses exposed as the grandest of illusions. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dark side of the American obsession with wealth and status, a stark reminder that in a world built on the perception of money, the most dangerous person is the one who understands that a convincing story can be more valuable than the money itself. It's a tantalizing thought, isn't it, that beneath the velvet and the gilt, some of these disasters weren't mere accidents of chance, but the result of something far more sinister, a deep-seated superstition that certain objects, especially the most dazzling jewels, carry with them a kind of cursed energy, a lingering misfortune for those who dare to wear them without the right lineage. Proper respect. Throughout history, the very gems meant to symbolize divine right and unshakable power have sometimes seemed to attract chaos, as if the weight of their troubled pasts is too heavy for any single crown to bear. And when we start to trace the path of one diamond in particular, the infamous Koh-i-Noor, the line between historical coincidence and a genuine curse becomes wonderfully, chillingly blurred. The story of the Koh-i-Noor, or Mountain of Light, is written in blood and conquest. Originating in India, this 105.6 carat diamond was not merely a gem. It was a symbol of sovereignty, fiercely fought over by Mughal emperors, Persian shahs, and Afghan rulers. Its history is a litany of betrayal, torture, and murder. One of its early owners, Persian ruler Nader Shah, was assassinated shortly after acquiring it. Its next keeper, the Afghan Emir Shah Shuja, was overthrown and forced to surrender the diamond under duress. By the time it came into the possession of the young Maharaja Duleep Singh and the Sikh Empire, the diamond's reputation was already one of bringing turmoil to any man who claimed it. Then came the British. After annexing the Punjab in 1849, the British East India Company demanded the Koh-i-Noor as a condition of the peace treaty, forcibly taking it from the 11-year-old Maharaja. It was presented to Queen Victoria in 1850, a glittering trophy of imperial expansion, but its arrival in London was shrouded in unease. Almost immediately, courtiers and advisors whispered that the diamond was bad luck. It was considered so unlucky, in fact, that a specific legend arose. It would only bring misfortune to any man who wore it, but could be safely possessed by a woman. This wasn't just a quaint superstition. It was a direct, almost desperate reinterpretation of its bloody history to make its presence in the British crown jewels feel less like a harbinger of doom. This is where the narrative weaves directly into our Coronation Day disasters. The Koh-i-Noor was first set into a dazzling brooch for Queen Victoria, but it was for the coronation of her daughter-in-law, Queen Alexandra, in 1902, that it was placed front and center, mounted into the brand new crown of Queen Alexandra. The coronation, you'll recall, was the one nearly derailed by King Edward VII's emergency appendectomy. Coincidence, perhaps, but then consider the next coronation where it featured prominently: the 1911 coronation of Queen Mary, wife of George V. This was the ceremony where the king's stubborn refusal to allow filming created a public relations disaster, alienating the monarchy from its modern audience. The Koh-i-Noor was there, glittering in Queen Mary's crown, and then, most strikingly, it was set into a new crown for Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, for the coronation of her husband, King George VI, in 1937. This was a coronation overshadowed by crisis, as it was not a planned celebration, but a rushed necessity following the shocking abdication of his brother, Edward VIII, a constitutional catastrophe that nearly broke the monarchy. 3 major 20th century coronations, 3 significant crises, and the Koh-i-Noor was present at every one. While we can logically attribute each event to political blunders, medical emergencies, and personal failings, the pattern is enough to make even the most skeptical historian pause and wonder if the diamond's turbulent past had somehow seeped into the very fabric of these royal occasions, exacting a subtle toll on the house that had taken it by force. This belief in cursed jewels was not confined to the vaults of Westminster. The same superstitious dread permeated the world of the Gilded Age heiresses, who often found that the magnificent parures they purchased or inherited came with invisible and sometimes devastating baggage. For these women, a famous jewel was more than an accessory. It was a passport into high society, a tangible piece of history they could wear. But sometimes they were buying a piece of someone else's tragedy. There were numerous tales of famous necklaces and tiaras rumored to carry a curse, often linked to a previous owner's untimely death, financial ruin, or scandalous divorce. To wear such a piece was to make a bold statement, but it was also to tempt fate, to drape oneself in the unresolved energies of a past life. In the competitive, judgmental world of the aristocracy, a single piece of bad luck following a grand ball could be instantly attributed not to social missteps, but to the malevolent influence of the diamonds around one's neck. One of the most poignant examples involves the legendary Hope Diamond, a deep blue gem with a provenance of misfortune that rivals the Koh-i-Noor. While it never entered the British royal collection, its story captivated the transatlantic elite. It was said to have been stolen from the eye of a Hindu idol, invoking a priest's curse upon all who would possess it. Its owners included the beheaded French monarch Marie Antoinette and a series of other figures who met with financial disaster, violence, or early death. The heiress Evelyn Walsh McLean, a fabulously wealthy American socialite, famously bought the Hope Diamond in the early 1900s, deliberately flouting its cursed reputation. She believed her own vibrant luck could overpower its dark history. She wore it constantly, even allowing her dog to wear it on his collar. And what was her fate? Her beloved son died in a car accident. Her daughter died by suicide. Her husband cheated on her and was eventually declared insane. And she herself died destitute. Her fortune completely evaporated. The press and public saw this not as a tragic sequence of unrelated events, but as the inevitable unfolding of the Hope Diamond's curse. For other heiresses, the lesson was clear. The most spectacular jewels could be reservoirs of ancient sorrow, and wearing them to your own personal coronation ball was a high-stakes gamble with forces you could not possibly understand or control. This fascinating intersection of royal history and heiress lore creates a compelling through line. Both the monarch anointed with the co-eye, nor and the socialite wearing a cursed parure were participating in a ritual of ascension. Both were using these objects as symbolic fuel for their climb to a new social peak. And in both cases, when disaster struck, be it a medical emergency that postponed a king's coronation or a series of personal tragedies that destroyed a family, the human need to find a pattern, a reason, reached for the simplest, most dramatic explanation. The jewels themselves were to blame. It was a way of making sense of the senseless, of attributing the chaotic nature of life to a tangible, if mystical, source. The cursed narrative provided a story where there was otherwise only chance, a dark fairy tale that gave meaning to misfortune. In the end, whether you believe in the supernatural or not, the power of these stories is undeniable. They remind us that the most coveted treasures often come with the heaviest hidden costs, and that the glittering prize of a crown or a title can sometimes feel less like a blessing and more like a beautifully crafted and potentially perilous burden. Yet, of all the potential disasters we've explored, from fumbled crowns to fatal stampedes, the most profound is arguably the one where the coronation never happened at all. This is the story of the ultimate coronation day that wasn't a seismic event, that didn't involve a single misplaced jewel or a single note of a botched anthem, but which shook the very foundations of the British monarchy and redefined it for the modern age. The year was 1936, and the crisis centered on a king who voluntarily surrendered his throne before he could ever be crowned, all for the love of an American woman. This was the abdication of Edward VIII, a drama that wove together every thread we've seen so far. The clash between modern desires and ancient duty, the terrifying power of public scandal, and the profound consequences of placing personal happiness above the weight of the crown. To understand the sheer magnitude of this upheaval, you have to understand the man at its center. Edward, known to his family as David, was the Prince of Wales, a global celebrity long before he became king. He was charming, charismatic, and modern, with a populist touch that made him wildly popular with the public. He had served with distinction in the Great War, and as Prince of Wales, he undertook extensive tours of the empire, projecting an image of a vibrant, forward-thinking monarchy. When his father, the stern and dutiful George V, died in January 1936, the nation expected a new, energetic reign. Edward ascended the throne without incident, but a time bomb was already ticking, one known only to a small circle within the government and the press. For years, the new king had been involved in a relationship with Wallis Simpson, a stylish, sharp-witted American from Baltimore who was not only a commoner, but was also twice divorced, with her second divorce still pending. From the perspective of the British establishment, Wallis Simpson was the embodiment of every nightmare they had about American interlopers, but magnified 1,000-fold. She wasn't just a wealthy heiress seeking a title. She was a woman whose marital status made her, in the eyes of the Church of England and the constitutional framework of the day, utterly unsuitable to be queen. The king was the supreme governor of the Church of England, an institution that at the time did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons if their former spouses were still alive. For Edward to marry a woman with 2 living ex-husbands was seen as a direct and unacceptable contradiction of his sacred role. This wasn't a matter of social snobbery. It was a fundamental constitutional and religious crisis. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and the governments of the Dominions made it brutally clear to the king he could not marry Mrs. Simpson and remain on the throne. The choice was stark and unprecedented: the crown or the woman he loved. What followed was a brief, intense, and utterly clandestine political stalemate that played out behind closed doors while the British public remained, for nearly a year, completely in the dark. The press barons, in an extraordinary act of collective self-censorship, agreed not to report on the king's relationship, fearing the damage it would do to the monarchy's prestige. But in America and across Europe, the story was front-page news. This created a bizarre and unsustainable situation where the entire world seemed to know about the king's dilemma, except for his own subjects. Edward, convinced of his own popularity, explored desperate options. He proposed a morganatic marriage where Wallis would become his wife, but not his queen, and any children would be excluded from the line of succession. This was a solution used in other European monarchies, but the British government flatly rejected it. The cabinet, the Dominion governments, and the church were united. There was no compromise possible. The crisis exploded into public view in early December 1936, when a British bishop finally alluded to the situation in a sermon, breaking the press embargo. Newspapers across Britain could no longer stay silent, and the story erupted, stunning the nation. The public was thrown into a maelstrom of confusion, sympathy, and shock. For 11 days, the country was gripped by a constitutional thriller, played out in daily newspaper headlines and frantic radio bulletins. Edward, seeing the implacable opposition of the government and realizing that his marriage would force the resignation of the prime minister and trigger a general election, made his decision. On December 10th, 1936, he signed the instruments of abdication. In a radio broadcast to the world the following day, his voice famously crackling through the airwaves, he explained his reasons to a global audience of millions, stating, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." The aftermath was a study in institutional whiplash and personal exile. Edward's younger, unprepared brother, the shy and stuttering Duke of York, was thrust onto the throne as King George VI. His coronation in 1937, which we touched on earlier, was not the joyous celebration it should have been, but a necessary, somber act of stabilization for a monarchy that had just been brought to the brink. The new king, who never expected or wanted the crown, saw his reign immediately defined by the need to restore dignity and reliability to an institution his brother had treated as disposable. Edward, now styled as the Duke of Windsor, married Wallis Simpson in France in June 1937, but their union was a gilded exile. He was never given a royal role or a purpose again, and the couple drifted through a perpetual, bitter social round in Paris and New York, forever the specters at the feast of the monarchy they had left behind. The abdication was more than a personal tragedy or a romantic scandal. It was the ultimate coronation day disaster because it voided the ceremony entirely, replacing it with a vacuum of authority. It demonstrated, in the most dramatic way imaginable, that the crown was not a personal possession, but an institution that demanded the complete subordination of the individual who wore it. Edward's desire for a private life was, in the context of his role, the most public of betrayals. Furthermore, it forever linked the figure of the American woman to the throne's greatest modern crisis. Wallis Simpson was not a fortune hunter in the mold of the Gilded Age heiresses. Her sin was not her nationality, but her marital status and the king's devotion to her. Yet, in the eyes of the establishment, she became the destructive force that nearly toppled 1,000 years of tradition, the ultimate outsider who cost Britain its king. The abdication of Edward VIII proved that the most dangerous threat to a coronation isn't a poorly planned ceremony or a clumsy bishop. It's a monarch who, when faced with the ultimate choice, discovers that he does not want the crown at all. After centuries of navigating fires, fumbled jewels, and abdication crises, the British monarchy might have hoped that the 21st century would finally offer a coronation free from major disaster. The ascension of King Charles III in 2023 was, by most historical standards, a triumph of meticulous planning and modern stage management. There was no fatal stampede, no king collapsing with appendicitis, and no crown was dropped. Yet, in our hyper-connected digital age, a new kind of chaos emerged, one not of physical calamity, but of perpetual, amplified public scrutiny, where every minor hiccup, real or perceived, could be instantly magnified into a global controversy. This was the first coronation of the social media era, and its disasters were measured not in blood or broken regalia, but in trending hashtags, viral videos, and the relentless, unforgiving court of online opinion. Consider the simple act of protest. Throughout history, coronations have faced public dissent, from the jeering crowds outside George IV's ceremony to the silent judgment of a populace during the Half-Crown-ation. But in 2023, dissent was no longer confined to the streets. While a small group of anti-monarchy protesters from the group Republic held up signs reading, "Not my king," along the procession route, their immediate physical impact was minimal, swiftly managed by a heavy police presence. The real demonstration, however, was happening on a billion screens simultaneously. The hashtag "Not My King" began trending globally on Twitter within minutes. Every smartphone held aloft by the cheering crowds also captured the protesters, and those clips were instantly uploaded, dissected, and debated. The narrative was no longer controlled by the BBC's carefully framed broadcast. It was being written in real time by millions of users. A protest that might have been a footnote in a newspaper column a generation ago became a dominant, inescapable theme of the day's online conversation, proving that in the modern era, a demonstration doesn't need to be large to be loud. It just needs a strong internet connection. This digital amplification extended forcefully to the deeply personal drama of the guest list, a controversy that laid bare the monarchy's ongoing family schisms for the entire world to analyze. The most glaring absence was, of course, Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, who attended the ceremony alone, sitting in the third row, a stark visual representation of his fractured relationship with the institution. His quick departure immediately after the service, speeding away without participating in the balcony appearance or the grand procession, was captured on video and became an instant symbol of the rift. But the online dissection went far deeper. Why was Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, who had been stripped of his military affiliations and royal patronages due to his own scandals, given a more prominent role, even wearing the ceremonial robes of the Order of the Garter? This juxtaposition was not lost on social media commentators, who created side-by-side images and lengthy threads critiquing the perceived hypocrisy. The guest list became a Rorschach test for the monarchy's priorities, with every seating arrangement and every visible interaction between family members fueling days of speculative content. The private tensions that once simmered behind palace walls were now the raw material for a global public autopsy, turning a day of unity into a showcase for unresolved discord. Even the meticulously choreographed moments of the ceremony itself were not immune to this relentless online nitpicking. The anointing, that most sacred and secret part of the ritual, was shielded from view by a three-sided screen, a nod to tradition and privacy. Yet, this act of reverence was instantly meme-ified. Social media users superimposed images of a British telephone booth, a shower cubicle, and even a pop-up changing room onto the screens, reducing a moment of profound spiritual significance to a punchline about awkward British modesty. Similarly, the moment Princess Charlotte, age 8, appeared to gently shush her younger brother, Prince Louis, during the lengthy ceremony was transformed from a simple, relatable sibling interaction into a viral sensation. It was endearing to many, but it also sparked a mini firestorm of debate about child behavior, parenting under pressure, and the burdens of royal life. Nothing was too small or too sacred to escape the microscope. The vibrant red uniform of the Princess of Wales was praised by fashion critics, but also spawned countless threads about its cost and symbolism at a time of national economic strain. In the past, a coronation was a single, monolithic narrative projected by the state. Now, it shattered into a million fragmented, conflicting stories the second it was broadcast, each one vying for attention in the digital marketplace. Perhaps the most telling modern mishap was one that played out entirely in the realm of public relations and optics. The decision to have the newly crowned king and queen wave to crowds from the Buckingham Palace balcony alongside only the working members of the royal family, a slimmed-down, firm, was a deliberate strategic move. Its intention was to project a modern, streamlined, and efficient monarchy for the future. Yet, this very act of control backfired in the court of public sentiment. For many viewers, the image of a sparsely populated balcony, with the conspicuous absences of Harry and his family, felt less like a fresh start and more like a cold, corporate consolidation of power. It was a visual that could be, and was endlessly compared to the packed, multi-generational balconies of coronations and jubilees past. The narrative of a slimmed-down monarchy, intended to be a strength, was instantly reinterpreted online as a story of exclusion and diminishment. This highlights the fundamental challenge for the crown in the 21st century. Every calculated move to adapt and modernize can, and will, be instantly deconstructed by a global audience that holds the institution to an impossible standard, expecting it to be both timelessly majestic and transparently relatable all at once. The disaster was not in the event itself, which was executed with flawless precision, but in the uncontrollable, fragmented, and often contradictory interpretations that became the day's true legacy. The crown may have survived the ceremony intact, but it could no longer control the story it told. So after exploring this incredible parade of misfires and misadventures, from fiery riots in 1066 to viral memes in 2023, it's worth taking a step back and asking a fundamental question: why? Why does this singular event, more than any other royal occasion, seem to be a magnet for chaos? The answer lies in a perfect and often explosive storm of factors that make a flawless coronation not just a challenge, but a statistical improbability. At its core, it's a collision of immense pressure, breathtaking complexity, the friction between the ancient and the modern, and the simple, undeniable fact of human fallibility. Think first about the sheer, suffocating pressure. A coronation is not a wedding or a state banquet. It is the single most important day in the life of a monarchy, a ritual that is meant to project an image of divine right, political stability, and unshakable continuity to the entire world. The monarch is not just a person. They are becoming a living symbol, and the ceremony is the moment of transformation. This places an almost inhuman burden on everyone involved. For the sovereign, it's the culmination of a lifetime of waiting, or the sudden, terrifying assumption of a role they may not have expected, as with George VI. For the clergy and officials, it's the performance of their lives, knowing that a single misstep will be witnessed by millions and recorded in the history books forever. This pressure cooker atmosphere is a fertile ground for mistakes. A bishop's hands sweat and fumble a sacred vessel. A young queen, like Victoria, has to rely on her wits when her elders are bungling the script. The weight of history itself seems to press down on the proceedings, making every action feel momentous and every potential error feel catastrophic. It's a high-stakes theatrical production where there are no understudies and no second chances, performed live on a global stage. Then layer onto that pressure the mind-boggling complexity of the choreography. A coronation is not a single event. It is a sprawling, multi-day series of intricate rituals, processions, and ceremonies, each with its own ancient rules and symbolic meaning. It's a logistical puzzle of epic proportions, coordinating everything from the movements of 1,000 soldiers in a military parade to the precise moment a ring is placed on a specific finger. You have foreign dignitaries who need to be seated in exact order of precedence, a delicate ballet of diplomacy where a misplaced chair can cause an international incident. You have priceless, centuries-old regalia that must be transported, secured, and handled with reverence. You have a cast of hundreds, from archbishops to choir boys, all of whom must hit their marks perfectly. It is, in essence, trying to execute a military operation, a religious sacrament, and a global media event simultaneously. With so many moving parts, it's a wonder that more doesn't go wrong. The lack of a single rehearsal, as with Victoria's coronation, can reduce the entire sacred rite to a confused farce. The system is so complex that it is inherently fragile, vulnerable to a single weak link, a nervous pier, a poorly maintained carriage, or a sudden summer downpour. This complexity is further complicated by the constant grinding clash between ancient tradition and modern realities. The coronation service itself is archaic, filled with rituals and oaths that hail from a time when the monarch's power was absolute and the world was a very different place. Yet, this ceremony must be performed in the contemporary world, with its television cameras, its democratic sensibilities, and its relentless 24/7 news cycle. This clash creates a zone of perpetual tension. We saw it with George V, who believed cameras would desecrate the Holy Abbey, creating a public relations disaster by seeming aloof and out of touch. We saw it with Edward VIII, whose modern desire for personal happiness was completely incompatible with the ancient, self-sacrificing demands of the crown. And we see it today, where every decision, from who is on the balcony to the cost of the ceremony, is instantly debated and dissected on social media. The monarchy is constantly trying to balance its need for mystery and tradition with the public's demand for transparency and relevance. A coronation forces this tension into the open, making it a battleground where the very identity of the institution is negotiated, often through very public stumbles and controversies. And underpinning all of this, the pressure, the complexity, the cultural clash is the most universal and unpredictable factor of all: simple human error. At the end of the day, a coronation is not carried out by flawless automatons or celestial beings. It is performed by people. A dean's grip can slip, sending the ampulla tumbling toward the stone floor. A queen's heavy robes can be pinned to the carpet to prevent a stumble, turning a sacred procession into a precarious walk. A king can succumb to a burst appendix. A horse can spook. These are not failures of planning or symbolism. They are reminders of our shared humanity. The most meticulously crafted plans in the world cannot account for a sudden case of nerves, a moment of distraction, or the basic physical limitations of the human body. This is perhaps the most relatable aspect of all these disasters. We've all had moments where we fumbled under pressure, where a carefully planned event went awry because of a tiny, unforeseen mistake. In these royal blunders, we see our own vulnerabilities reflected back at us. And it's this humanity, peeking through the gold leaf and the imperial purple, that makes the spectacle so endlessly compelling. The quest for a perfect coronation is a fight against entropy itself, a struggle to impose perfect order on a world that is, by its very nature, gloriously and chaotically imperfect. And so, the grand tapestry of royal history, woven with threads of gold and crimson, reveals that for every moment of sublime pageantry, there is a corresponding episode of pure, unscripted chaos. We have traveled from the smoke-filled panic of William the Conqueror's abbey to the agonizing personal choice that left Edward VIII's throne forever empty. We've witnessed the outrageous, like the spectacle of a king barricading himself against his own wife, the tragic, like the blood-soaked field at Katinka that foretold a dynasty's doom, and the downright hilarious, like a queen's coronation ring being painfully jammed onto the wrong finger by a flustered bishop. We've seen crowns fumbled, tiaras shattered, and empires nearly crumble over a stolen stone. We've watched American heiresses trade vast fortunes for titles only to find themselves prisoners in gilded cages, their coronation into high society culminating in public snubs and private despair. What these spectacular failures share is their profound humanity. They prove that beneath the imperial crowns and the weight of millennia of tradition, the people at the center of these dramas were just that, people. They got nervous, they made mistakes, they fell in love with the wrong person, and they sometimes stumbled under the immense burden placed upon them. It is in these flawed, relatable moments that history truly comes alive. A perfectly executed ceremony is a beautiful painting, static and remote. A coronation where a lord rolls down the steps, a queen nearly falls backward under the weight of her own grandeur, or a king's appendicitis upends the plans of an entire empire. That is a story. These disasters are the cracks in the royal veneer, the glimpses of reality that make these distant, monumental figures accessible to us. They transform a sterile historical account into a gripping narrative of ambition, fear, vanity, and the glorious, unpredictable mess of being human, even when your destiny is to sit upon a throne. Ultimately, this journey through royal misfortune shows us that the quest for a perfect coronation is a battle against the impossible. It is a struggle to impose absolute order on a world that thrives on chaos, to mask mortal fallibility with a facade of divine infallibility. The true, enduring power of these stories isn't in the perfection of the ritual, but in its glorious imperfection. It's a reminder that history is not made in the quiet, faultless moments, but in the noisy, complicated, and often disastrous ones. So, we turn the question over to you. After this tour of fiery, fumbled, and fractured coronations, which disaster stood out most vividly in your mind? Was it the sheer tragedy of Katinka Field, the audacious scandal of the abdication, or the simple, comedic chaos of Queen Victoria's unrehearsed ceremony? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the scandals and secrets that have shaped the world's most powerful dynasty.